All right, so we're going to jump right into the historical nature and the background of Dante as we prep and are readying ourselves to learn Dante's Inferno. Um, if you have not already started reading, go ahead and begin doing that process. Make sure to follow the syllabus for that. Um, I'm going to sweep very quickly. However, there still is an ample amount of information, so be prepared to sit down a little bit for this video. It will probably be at least 30 minutes long. That being said, this is what we do instead of the brick and mortar classroom at this moment. So hang in there, stop it when you need, take notes however you need to. You do not need to write down everything exactly from this, okay? So this is a quick overarching look at the historical nature of Dante. So a little bit, what we want to understand first is that Dante has done something really extraordinary for his time period. He did something quite different that we hadn't seen before in literature, and that is he incorporates a lot of other traditions of writing and weaves them together into his own work. Um, he does this specifically, the sort of the biblical and the classical tradition of literature. Joyce often said that Dante was his spiritual food. It's a big deal. Dante is taking different sorts of texts and combining them to do something new and different. So the reason that Dante is such a big deal is not only because of his artistic work, but also just the creative ingenuity that he does in the creation of it. Dante himself is a geographer of the cosmos and of the individual human soul. He dramatizes and asks us to reflect on deep deep questions that involve our political institutions, deep questions that involve our spiritual institutions, deep questions that involve our internal and external reality. He struggles with the nature of what is a moral action and the possibility of even what does a true spiritual transformation look like. Um, these are his reasons for writing, and it should be our reasons for reading, is to give us at least something to think about. Not that we need to agree with Dante. In fact, there's a lot of time where I think Dante even struggles agreeing with himself in certain ideas. So it's totally okay to have disagreements with him, but we want to appreciate what he's done, and hopefully we can get through this with a lot of knowledge, but even more questions that will continue our search for learning. Now, Dante does this all in the demanding Italian verse known as Terza Rima. The Divine Comedy is a three-part pilgrim's journey undertaken by Dante to the realms of the Christian afterlife. Obviously, the three parts are hell, purgatory, and heaven. It's comedy, of course, because it's a positive ending and not a tragedy with a negative ending. He's not that it's funny, not that it's stand-up comedy or anything like that. The encounters with sinners and people in the Inferno are concerned with deepening Dante and the reader's intellectual understanding of the nature of sin, and the understanding of the nature of the things that we do and the mistakes that we make. Sin is divided into three broad categories: incontinence, violence, and fraud. Incontinence is not a word that a lot of people use now, but it's sort of an uncontrollable um, an inability to calm your own desire. It's kind of, sort of the fiery of the passions, which isn't always necessarily a bad thing, but to a degree, when it goes beyond the typical and becomes completely uncontrollable, then Dante considers that, of course, a sinful action. Now, the poem itself is 14,000 lines long. It's divided into three parts, and each of those is divided into cantos. Canto means song, and so it's like little chapters that it does. Now, the whole is divided into 100 cantos, 34 in the Inferno and 33 in both Purgatorio and Paradiso. These are the chapter divisions, and each one is about 140 lines each, made up of three-line units called tercets, which is the terza rima, and that's ABA, BCB. That's the rhyme scheme that he does it in. So a lot of detail and work has been made to not just make and write incredible lines, but to also do it in such a structurally coherent way that that part or that aspect of the writing alone is genius. I mean, look at the symmetry of it. It's something that's so visual and beautiful just in that sense alone. So it's also different from other earthly or early epics because Dante casts himself as a hero of his own poem. His biography is therefore not simply window dressing, but an actual and essential element to the poem. Dante sets the poem halfway through his life. He was born in 1265, so 1300, because halfway through the life was considered to be around 70 years old, and he looks at 35 as being that age. So 1300 is when he sets the Inferno to happening. So the character of who he is in the Inferno is 35, though Dante is writing it at a much older age. Because Dante allows such a huge scope, anything is fair game as a subject. Um, Anything at all can be talked about, contemplated, and he's trying to deal with some extremely large issues. And that's one of the big reasons that this text has such a universal relevance to us. Dante's Florence had around 100,000 people at the time he lived there. Now, he grew up in an economically prosperous merchant family, so he's middle class. And this is really around the time that middle class actually even is happening all throughout the world. It's the first time that we've really seen it. So there's this sort of middle place, and a lot of questions about who should be in charge and things like that are happening. Now, this is a politically tumultuous time because you do have a new class that we haven't seen, and it's going to be different people vying for power. And as Dante, the young man, grows up, he develops two big passions. Those two passions are poetry and then politics. Now, at a young age, he wrote a work called the Vita Nuova, and that is the new life. It's a collection of love poems that he wrote for a woman named Beatrice, and he was in love with her, and she also died at a very young age. So he wrote them for her. It was his big, long lost love, and she will actually make quite a few scenes of our Divine Comedy. Now, Dante also had real success, though, as a politician. Florence didn't have any sort of executive government, so every 2 months they would change officials, and there were 6 positions that served these 2 terms. They were called priors. Now, Dante was one of these priors, but the city itself was very factionalized, and it exiled many people. Dante would later be exiled, and he writes the poem while he's in exile, probably shortly before his death. So the poem itself, in many ways, is also about Florence, but from somebody who's living far from the city. This is a poem of exile, and we're going to think about what this idea of what exile means as we continue thinking through the poem as well. Now, the political background of Dante is important to the Divine Comedy, especially to the Inferno, because Dante continually makes political commentary, though not only out of his own mouth, but through the mouth of Virgil and other guides and different people that he meets. Therefore, it's important to understand what's happening in Florence around the time of Dante. Now, we'll get to that in a second. So we first need to think about who can be in the Inferno. Since it's starting at 1300, period, anybody that's been dead by 1300, 1299 all the way to Adam and Eve, real people, fictional people, mythological creatures, any of these can be in the Inferno. When Dante looks at political commentary, he might go all the way back to Julius Caesar. He might go back to Alexander the Great. He might even go back to Emperor Trajan. Most often, however, he's going to go back one generation in Italy and in Florence, because these are the people that have died that he knows, and these are the stories that he's grown up with. Now, a lot of people populate Dante's afterlife that have died recently because they are known by Dante's audience, and they're stories that he knows. And he will use these stories that he knows to talk about the present. Now, one example of this is a story of a wedding that happened in 1215. The bridegroom dumped his girl because he got a better offer, and as a result, a whole bunch of people ended up dead, including the bridegroom. Now, Dante uses this to show the symbolic truth of the nature of urban violence in Florence. Now, there are many economic tensions working within Florence because you have the working class of wealthy merchants who are rising, And the traditional nobility says, hey, you aren't us. Old money, new money sort of thing. We have a whole Great Gatsby thing going on here. So the traditional nobility, of course, snubs them, and they are trying to therefore vie for their own sense of power. Now, Florence is at the time, it's an independent nation. So Italy does not become a country until the 19th century. Florence is very important economically because of its situation geographically. There are so many new powers raising up besides the clergy and royalty that by the end of the 11th century, the big question is who rules the world? I mean, in the next 200 years, you're going to have people like Machiavelli coming in writing. You're going to have Shakespeare in the next 300, 400 years writing about different ideas of kingship. So this begins to be, especially when the Black Plague comes along, people are going to be asking this question because nobility dies off, and Black Plague isn't like just focusing on peasants; it's killing everybody. So, but around the time of Dante, people are already beginning to ask this question: who has the authority from God to rule everyone else in the world? Is it a sense of divine right? Is it just, what is it? Who has that authority? And in Dante's 13th century, this question becomes extremely important politically, because well, we have to look at that. We have to look at Italy for that. Now, Italy is going to be cut into really three areas, although this one shows a few more. But it's really divided into uh, three different segments or three different slices: an upper, a middle, and a lower. You can see that better in this picture here. So the middle third was controlled by the Pope, and it was not just a spiritual center, but it was also political territory. And the bottom third was ruled by the French monarch. Okay, so in 1220, something big happens. The French monarch, or the King of the South, Frederick II, also gets named the Holy Roman Emperor. And this means, in theory, that he should also rule the north where Florence is. So the Pope would sit in the middle of this ruler's territory. That's not the best place for the Pope to sit. You know what I'm saying? He's kind of stuck and wedged, sandwiched in between the two areas of the Holy Roman Empire. So this tension is intense, and Frederick really wants to have full control. So in the north in Florence, there are a whole bunch of factions, and they all wanted either the Pope or Frederick on their side. So those that wanted Frederick were called the Ghibellines, and those that wanted the Pope were called the Guelphs. Okay, so these two factions, they would constantly trade back and forth with being in power, because once a group was in power, it would break into more factions within the group, and then it would fight itself. So there's constant power struggle, constant change happening. But by 1290, during Dante's time, which is 70 years of this mess going on, the Ghibellines are old news, and the Guelphs are in power. But within them, you have the whites and the blacks, and both of these groups wanted support from the Pope, and that's Pope Boniface VIII. Now, Dante is on the white side, and Boniface finally moves to the black side, and he rids Florence of many of the whites, and this is the direct cause of Dante's exile. Evidently, Pope Boniface was also a conehead, for those of you that have watched old Saturday Night Live skits. Either that or he wore an egg on his head. He just looks like a really fun guy to be around. So Dante's exile. At first, Dante wanted to just wait out the time in exile. He thought that soon the cards would change and that he could come back. But something bigger happens to Dante. He begins to think about, what does it mean to be in exile? Dante really turned his attention elsewhere instead of thinking about going back, and he begins to think about this larger meaning. And it's not just pondering, the state of the universe in a vacuum. He sets out to systematically read, study, and meditate, basically making himself one of the most learned people to ever write down anything, to put pen to ink, or quill to ink in his case. So Dante suggests that we are all, in a sense, exiles from the promised land of heaven, and this becomes a metaphor for the human condition to Dante. Now, Dante sort of racks his brains, and he says, okay, so what's so unjust about the way that we're governing ourselves, and what can we do about it? How can we change it? How can we untangle and understand a way for us all to live together well? Because Dante understood that the goal of human life may not be earthly happiness, but earthly happiness was important and was a pretty good condition for people able to seek things that, are there beyond the grave. If you simply are just grubbing around and survive, you know that to survive is just to, you know, eke out in a sense of an existence. Um, so Dante is asking these bigger questions like, how can we enjoy this existence now? It's actually quite different from what we see in the evangelical Christianity in the past 300 years that seem to be a lot more focused on the extent of, oh, where do we go in that sense? It's much more, uh, there's much more of a, how can we live the good life now? So Dante sort of falls in lines with a lot of the philosophers from ancient Greece by doing that. But Dante's going to be using three sources. There are three literary antecedents that we're going to talk about, and he uses them consistently to help write the Divine Comedy. Now, Dante's three guides in the Commedia show how his journey is a combination of both the universal and the particular. In writing about the journey, the poet is going to use all these literary sources to sort of tap out the existing traditions and put them in dialogue with his own concerns. So he's going to universalize the poem without also losing a sense of its particularity. So we're going to discuss how the Bible was read in the Middle Ages and show some of the ways that the Commedia can be seen as an imitation of the Bible. We'll also talk about the importance of Virgil's Aeneid as a source for Dante, and then, of course, St. Augustine. So the Bible was to people in the Middle Ages. Um, it was not just a source of their religious identity. It was not just a source of organization or churches, but it was a mind in which one could find valuable stuff about every conceivable subject. People went to it for common sense sort of measures. People went to it to try to understand the way that the world worked, which was really what the Bible was written for in the first place. It wasn't just to inculcate a sort of religious identity. It was a book about a group of people and its expansion. And then within that, a lot of the different ideas of how a person should live or laws to live by are put into there. Now, the Bible was a book of life. It was a story that was very alive and it had this beginning and it had this end. And so, seeing that narrative framework, Dante is, of course, going to be insisting on using that within his own framework. Now, for Dante's time period, I mean, you have, you know, somewhere between 1,000 years separating them, but the gap and the bridge between that time period of when the Bible was written and also Dante's existence and the people there, they did not see that as such a big gap. They didn't see that as a really huge distancing. And so the modern life at the time was in constant dialogue with the past. It connected the past and the present, and uh, it wasn't so much, hey, what did it mean for that time period, but also what does this mean for me? What does this mean for me now? So the people in the Middle Ages really connected to the Old Testament and to the New Testament, and that's something that modern people should probably do now more. Is how do these teachings, how do these sacred texts, whether the Bible or whatever other sacred text somebody's reading, how do these interwork and interweave with the person that I'm becoming now? So Dante writes his own poem in imitation of the Bible. He doesn't simply use stories and characters or give the Bible a special place in his book. He's imitating the Bible in sort of the fundamental sense that he writes typologically. Each event is connected with others and it needs to be understood as a whole unit. So context is very important. He has a very specific hermeneutic that he goes about in trying to unlock the intention of the Bible and how that's going to create a sense of unlocked tension and intention within his own Divine Comedy. So for the most part, we think that this is a fiction that Dante invented about a journey of a character named Dante to the afterlife. But the great fiction of the poem is that it is nonfiction. It is not fiction that Dante wants us to think of it as. He wants us to take it in as the same seriousness as we would with the events of the Bible. Now, he may know that it's fiction, he may know that it's allegorical, but he is truly thinking that he's adding something of substance to the biblical account here. He's adding a text, he's adding a commentary. He's adding his own sort of Talmud, if you will, to the idea. So the Inferno, of course, then becomes allegorical to the bondage in Egypt. The Inferno is when the Hebrews were in bondage. The Purgatorio is their wilderness experience. And Paradiso is when they finally reach the Promised Land. And Dante sees that as a way to go about understanding his Divine Comedy. Now, beyond the Bible, Dante also has an extreme affiliation with the Aeneid. Virgil shows up very early in the poem, and he's Dante's guide through the Purgatorio, and finally he'll give way to Beatrice as Dante's guide in Paradise. Now, the Aeneid was, of course, a great epic poem that Dante imitated, and many of the characters from the poem end up also in the Divine Comedy. But Dante sort of reworks the characters because he doesn't agree with Virgil on a lot of aspects, so he's not satisfied with a lot of the answers that Virgil decides upon. And in fact, Virgil does that himself within the Aeneid. Dante then therefore goes back to Troy because it's sort of the source of many important things in his worldview. Though it's not as important as going back to the Bible, but it's on almost equal footing. Troy is about Roman history, which turns out to also be Dante's history since he's part of the Holy Roman Empire, and of course you have the Holy Roman Catholic Church. For Dante, the Roman Empire is an opportunity for greater justice. It's an opportunity for less competition. And remember, in Florence, you have competition and instability. And so Dante believes that this bigger sort of world government was needed to create a sense of stability. So side by side, you have the Roman Empire and the Church. So the story of Book 2 in Dante in the Aeneid is, of course, Dante's own story. Now, Dante's journey in some way piggybacks the journey of Aeneas and can't be fully understood without that journey also being known. Aeneas' relationship with Dido is an inspiration for Dante and his ability to recover after mistakes that he makes along the way. Because Dante's journey starts out, after all, when he's lost in a dark wood. This notion of learning how to recover after being completely lost, after making a huge mistake. And remember, of course, that Aeneas also goes to the underworld, and in many ways, Dante becomes Aeneas, especially in that sense of going and exploring the underworld. Now, why does Virgil guide Dante? Why did Dante come to the point that Virgil was the one to guide him through? Well, first of all, he knows the territory. He writes about the underworld. He claims his right to be Dante's guide. There's a great deal of geography that Virgil created in Book 6 of the Aeneid that Dante also uses in the Inferno. Virgil suggests that people get what they deserve, and in his depiction, and Dante agrees, in it, in not only the Christian sense, but in Virgil's classical sense as well. Virgil was Dante's inspiration and is begging Dante to outdo him. He's, hey, you can do better than me. Go up, take the next step. It's as if Dante must go down before he can come up, which also fits with the Christian tradition. And then, of course, Virgil can't be in heaven because he was not a Christian. So, according to Dante, he is, of course, going to be at least in the outer reaches of hell. So your third text is Augustine's Confessions. Now, Augustine was born in North Africa in 354 AD. So about the time Christianity is at a transitional period from the persecuted religion to becoming a dominant religion in the Roman Empire. Augustine also wrote about himself in the Confessions, and Dante gets his idea from this. In the previous epic literary tradition, this was never found. Homer did not write about himself, he wrote about Odysseus. Virgil didn't write about himself, he wrote about Aeneas. But Dante does write about himself. And this idea about writing about the self and writing about the self in terms of a spiritual autobiography turns out to be extremely important to Dante, especially in the Divine Comedy. Among other things, we can see that this is a great epic that is about a spiritual autobiography of Dante. So Augustine converted around 18 after being extremely sexually active, and he decides he must put off sexuality totally, but he often finds himself slipping time and time again. This is very similar to Dante in the Dark Wood, but Augustine writes in Book 8 of the Confessions about going to a tree and picking up the Bible and reading the words of Paul that suggest putting away the nature and denying ourselves by relying on God. This is what Augustine needs, and he's filled with confidence. Dante concludes that he also needs to make some sort of choice like this. The Confessions then kind of becomes a spiritual journey towards truth. And that truth ultimately leads to Christianity. But before Augustine tries lots of things that says, no, it's not working. But as he looks at Christianity, he's also helped by the readings of Plato, and later suggests these readings really help him in understanding the truth of Christianity. So he's taking both classic and biblical traditions to find truth. Dante is also trying to do this through the Bible and through Virgil. Virgil's Dante's guide, like Plato was for Augustine. Now, that being said, this is a great place to help you understand that Dante's geography, Dante's ideas, both spiritually, politically, and geographically, of the cosmos and the way things work, are going to be influenced by people like Augustine and Plato and Virgil. And that does not mean that this exact sort of belief system, as he's saying, you have to believe this exact sort of way. There are lots of problematic issues with this. Many people within the Christian tradition are very frustrated with Augustine's view of sex, for example. But remember, Dante is doing this in the 1300s, and so you have to allow his limited narrative to sort of become a highway for your own thought and a highway for your own way of thinking. You do not have to agree with him, but you need to be in dialogue with him, just the same way that he did with Plato and Augustine and others. That's the end of this part for now. We will continue on soon as we begin looking at the poem itself.